Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle William McCabe, je suis directeur de développement d'affaires pour ONCAMPUS Paris et je voudrais vous souhaiter la bienvenue à Study on Spotlight. Hi there, my name is Will McIver and I'm the Director of Business Development in OnCampus Paris. I'd like to welcome you to Study on Spotlight today.
Thank you, Will. Oh, we have OnCampus Paris here today with us. So here's Will and here's Ruby from OnCampus as well. So, as we mentioned, it's about Paris. When we think about Paris, what's the first thing come up in our mind?
What's the first thing that comes up in your mind?
Recently will be definitely for the Summer Olympic. The opening ceremony is so French style, I would say.
Exactly, yeah.
Other than that, the other one, the first thing definitely will be École for the fashion industry, because I studied fashion marketing. And then wine. What else? Anything?
Yeah, I would say food and wine and romantic atmosphere, I would say.
Yeah. So why students? So as on campus having a campus in Paris, so why students would need to think about as a study destination, I would say, as we just mentioned about.
Well, as you mentioned, you mentioned all the things that make Paris very, very attractive and France very famous anyway, which is why it attracts 89 million visitors a year, because they all come for the monuments, the museums, the art galleries, the food, the romance, the culture, the glamour, the glitz, the haute couture, all the different things you talk about. And France markets itself very well in that respect. But what France is also very well known for is its first-class education system. Doesn't kind of sell itself as well in that department as well as, say, the English-speaking countries, the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They all do it very, very well. France is a little bit shy and more reticent in that respect. But what you have there, in addition to it being a first-class tourist destination, a first-class kind of fashion destination, famous for all those other things, it has high-quality education. But the most important thing is it has high-quality education, but at low cost. It's not a very expensive place to study. And it's a bit of a hidden secret. I think France is like a real treasure. Once you find out what France has to offer when it comes to the education system, it's like a little treasure trove that just keeps on giving and giving and giving. And that's what we're here to talk about today.
Oh, okay. So you just mentioned about, because everyone, when we think of study destination, we think about the English-speaking country. So how do you compare the study styles or the curriculum within between France or the other English-speaking country? Let's say UK, the most closest country that just next to the neighbor country.
And probably the one that Hong Kong students are probably most familiar with, I imagine. It's quite an interesting question, because I would say that there's certain aspects to French education which are really something to be praised, and there's certain aspects which are probably best not talk about. But I think when it comes to the school education system, it's very, very different from the style of education we get in the English-speaking countries, where the English-speaking countries tend to encourage students to be more kind of expressive, to use originality, independence of thought, to sort of kind of challenge their teachers. That's not so much the case when it comes to the school style in France. It's very kind of rigid. It's quite sort of, in some ways, I would say, it's a strong word, but quite authoritarian. The teacher is an authority figure, and what he or she says goes. So it doesn't allow for the same level of creative thinking, but it does allow for a lot of critical thinking, which is something the French are very, very proud of. Their logic, their sort of kind of adherence to philosophy, their sort of ability to kind of think logically through issues. Whereas I think in the USA and the UK we tend to be more creative about those kind of things. But when it comes to the secondary system, first up you have a 3-year undergraduate system, which then leads into a 2-year master's system. That's where the French education really comes into its own. You have universities, the very traditional ones, the public universities, but France has something which is quite unique, which is called the Grande École system. Now, Grande École means in French, it means great school, big school, elite institution. But the Grande École system is kind of akin, very, very similar to the Russell Group in the USA, the UK, the Ivy League in the USA, or the Group of 8 in Australia. It's C9 in China. It's the elite band of universities or institutions that students go to in order to reach the very, very top of their profession. And that's where French students aspire to go to. They tend to want to go to the Grande École rather than the public universities, because the public universities offer a very kind of rigid type of academic style teaching, whereas the Grande École kind of imitate that sort of, Anglo-Saxon style of teaching, which is prepares students for the very, very higher echelons of government, public administration, business, science, law, whatever, fashion as well. And that's where students want to go to. So your average French student would do about 2 years of what we call preparation courses. They study very, very hard. They're a bit like Hong Kong students doing their school exams. They study long into the night. In fact, they have a nickname for them. They're called moles because they never see the daylight, because they study so hard. But they know that once they get into a Grande École, like we have, they are kind of made it. They can take a step back and think, wow, as long as I do everything right, I get to study correctly, I get the internship, then from there I'll go into a top job. And that's where the French system really comes into its own and is something to be proud of. So it's a truly elite type of system when it gets to the Grande École system.
So all the Grande École universities, are they private? Or how's it, apart from the public and the Grande École, so do they pay more? I just want, like, students pay more on the tuition fee?
They do pay more than they would do in a public university. For example, going to a French university is not complicated for an international student because it can be quite low cost or almost free in certain respects. But obviously you're dealing with different levels of kind of engagement and quality there. Whereas if you're going to a Grande École, you are going to be paying a little bit more. But even then, it's still not considerably more compared to what you would be paying in a top, say, business school in, say, Germany or the United States or the UK. In fact, you can go to, just an interesting fact is that France has the highest representation in the Financial Times top 100 business schools than any other country. The 25 out of those 100 business schools are actually French. So it's a high representation than, say, the UK or the USA. So once you are in there, you're getting a truly top education, but you'd be very, very surprised at the price you're paying compared to what you'd be paying in the USA. So in the USA, you get high quality education, but you're going to pay for it. You pay as well. In the UK, you get high quality education, but you're going to pay for it. Now, here's the interesting thing is that in France, you don't necessarily have to pay the same amount. So you can actually get a French degree in a Grande École, which could lead to a top job in industry for as little as 30,000 euros.
30,000 euros for the whole course?
Yeah, for a 3-year degree. Yeah.
So that mainly makes like a 10,000 euro. How much is that in Hong Kong dollar? Hold on.
10,000 euro. That's about
100,000 Hong Kong. So 300,000 Hong Kong dollars, roughly speaking.
That's quite comparing to the UK or the other.
It's very good value for money.
It is. Well, of course, including like on top, you have to add on the living cost. So is living cost like expensive in Paris?
Again, here's another surprise. Remember what I was saying before about it being a little treasure trove? When you start digging around, you find little surprises. Paris is not the most expensive city in the world, despite the fact that it's actually classed as the third most international city in the world after New York and London. But surprisingly, it's quite cheap compared to some other places. For example, a student who could live there for just over 1,000 euros a month, including their accommodation. But we normally say that students, in fact, the French government stipulates that students, in order to get the visa, have to have at least 650 to cover their living costs each month when they're in France. But 650 is considerably low. And it is possible in certain cities in France. But in Paris, you would probably be looking at something like 1,200, 1,300 in order for you to have a really kind of good experience. You don't want students to be skimping and scraping and sort of living cheaply, but to have to really have that Paris experience, about 1,300 to 1,400 euros would be a good idea.
That budget is really considering reasonable and friendly to our students as well.
Compared to the UK.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah,
especially when we're talking about UK top university, we're talking about like £30 a year. We're talking about like a year for tuition fee, but if we're talking about like 30,000 euro for the whole 3 years, that's completely another story.
It is, and that's the great surprise. I always say that France is the gift that keeps on giving. Yeah.
Well, our student would definitely need to explore this destination more and what degree options or what kind of lifestyles that student will experience. So you mentioned about the course, you mentioned about this first 2 years as a general, did it? And then also mentioned about internship and practice, like practical work. So is it a must for students living in France? They need to do that internship in order to graduate? Is it like a compulsory?
if you want a degree and if you want a good job in France, and if you're going to a Grande École, you would need to do the internship. But that's the reason why the students would actually go to one of these, top Grande École, is because the attention is all focused on those Grande École. Bear in mind that sort of only 1 in 10 students actually goes to a Grande École, so only 10% of French students go to a Grande École. So basically, employers are not interested in the other. Well, it sounds a bit sort of harsh, but sort of 90. If you go to one of the, if you're part of the other 90%, you're not as kind of attractive as say the glorious 10%. So if you go to one of these Grande École and you're part of that 10%, you get a lot of attention. So the top companies tend to work in tandem with the Grande École in a way that they probably don't in the UK. So I'm actually from the UK, and I did an internship, but it certainly wasn't the same kind of internship you'd be doing in France nowadays. And I think that obviously in the UK you can do an internship or not do an internship. You'll get a job, or you might not get a job. So you usually do get a job. Whereas in France you have to do the job. It's the internship that gets you the job. And something like 65% of students who do an internship end up working for that very, very company.
Okay.
And the type of companies we're talking about are sort of kind of a good snapshot of the French industrial and commercial landscape. You're talking about a lot of these top French multinationals. In fact, the interesting thing about France is a lot of people don't even realize that some of the top companies in the world are French. AXA, so BNP, Paribas, Airbus. Not to mention as well the sort of possibility you can get of working in one of the in the luxury brand arena for Louis Vuitton, L'Oreal, Coach, any one of these type of companies as well, because fashion and business tend to be sort of one and the same. Fashion is business in France, whereas it's not really in the UK. They're two very separate entities. And there's a lot of crossover. So a lot of our students will end up in the luxury brand arena as well. So it's quite an exciting sort of opportunity for our students in a way that they're probably not aware of. And what you find is more and more students are becoming interested in France these days, because of challenges in some other major English-speaking destinations, Canada, Australia, the United States. We've seen the news recently. So France is actually attracting a lot more interest in a way that it didn't before.
Okay. So you mentioned about the internship that everyone, it's unlike the UK system where it's optional. It's like having that placement year that taking out. So student would do an extra year on top of the original degree. So what about in France? Is it the uni will find a placement for them, so it's assigned to the student no matter what? Or does it have to be based on their GPA, the results that they're getting?
Obviously, the students study hard in order to get the best kind of internships, but there's a huge pool of internships available for students every year. And what the university does, or the institution does, is guide the students in the right direction. So nobody's going to come out sort of into a crowded hall and say, hello, Jimmy Lee, where are you, Jimmy Lee? Yes, we have an internship for you in Mercedes, is that okay? No, I want to go to Audi. It's not going to work like that. Nobody's going to come and spoon feed you that. But we give plenty of direction for the students to go and do that. And, there are plenty of internships going around. Obviously, there's competition for some of the best internships. But a student who wants an internship in their place of choice will get that. So it's not uncommon for our students to work in the likes of Société Générale, BNP Paribas. They work in Airbus. Some of them will work in the luxury brand arena. So they'll even go further afield into places like Germany, Italy, or the UK. The students can actually do their internship anywhere. Okay. They're not limited to just France. And the other interesting thing, it's not an additional year. It's actually baked into the program. So you do this as part of your program. And in fact, there's a work experience takes place every single year. And in fact, the Grande École sort of pride themselves on the fact that students are learning while doing. So even in their first year, they'll do, say, 4 weeks of work placement. In the second year, they'll do sort of another maybe 3 months of work placement. In the third year, another 3 months of work placement. That's just at undergraduate level. At master's level, you would actually do your work placement or your internship after you've already finished the academic segment of your degree. So that would mean, for example, in June of the graduating year, you would finish your academics, then you would go off for 6 months to go and do and work your way through whichever company you're going into. And then you come back and graduate. So it's quite an interesting sort of option for our students.
But international students struggle with the languages as well. Surely with the in the job market and in the company, like French is the common language that they use. So as an international student, probably which mainly we know English, limited French. Well, how they adapt and how they fit into that kind of culture and how they survive in a way?
Much easier than you think, actually. And the reason why is because most students have this kind of what they call language barrier. So they always, in fact, the phrase is always, people always say to me, so is there a language barrier in France? And I say, I don't want to ever hear the word language barrier ever again. I want to use the word language opportunity. And that's what it is. Now look, I mean, the programs we do are in English, and France has undergone a massive cultural and economic shift over the past 30 or 40 years, whereas when I was a student, which was a long time ago in France, everything was in French, and only, there was probably only 5% of the programs in French universities were hosted in English. But if you look at Grande École, the Grande École system, for example, in the business programs, Kedge, which is our major partner, 95% of those programs are now in English. So a student who comes from Hong Kong or indeed anywhere can spend the next 4 years not having to speak a single word of French. But would they enjoy the country? They'll obviously enjoy the country more if we teach them French, and moreover, it will give them sort of greater opportunities when it comes to getting those internships. Because even if the multinationals you're going into are looking for students with English language competencies, they still want people to have a level of French. So they're multinational organizations, so everything is in English, but at the same time, French comes in very, very handy. But the other thing about French is that I think people's fears about sort of not being able to communicate when they arrive there are very, very different from the stereotypes. A lot of these stereotypes are based on sort of, kind of American tourists coming over talking loudly, and sort of people being very, very aloof in Paris and not interested in speaking any English to them. Maybe that was partly true about 30, 40 years ago. But as a rough rule of thumb, and the joke I always make, and Ruby's heard this a million times, but if you're in France and you want to speak English, if you're talking to somebody of my age or older, they usually don't speak English. But if they're my age or younger, they usually do speak English. You're going to have to guess how old I am then. But obviously, and that will determine whether we're going to remain friends or not, Jade. But the young people do tend to speak English, and they're quite happy to do that. And in fact, the penetration of of English in France is considered to be around the 65% mark. So what that means, 65% of people in France speak English to a greater or lesser degree. That's a lot lower than what you would find in, say, somewhere like Norway or Sweden or Denmark or Holland or, Finland or whatever. But then the question I always put to people is, why do those countries have to speak English to such a high level of competency? It's quite simple. Nobody else speaks their language. Nobody learns Swedish. Nobody speaks Norwegian, unfortunately, even though they're beautiful languages. However, people do speak French, and there's 400 million people in the world still speak French. In fact, Paris isn't even the biggest French-speaking city in the world. It's in Africa. It's Kinshasa. Yeah. So it's an opportunity for students, not just a barrier.
So, but is it hard to learn French? Because I didn't get a chance to learn when I was studying in the UK, so kind of like a shame. But I've heard my friends when they're doing French, it was like, oh, it's much harder than Spanish or any other European country language. Would you think so, or because you grow up?
No, I think sort of what we have to bear in mind is most students think that way when they come. In fact, that's probably your typical student would say, oh, I don't want to learn French, it's going to be really, really difficult. But then they think, well, most of our students who come to us tend to be bilingual at least, trilingual, sometimes quadrilingual. I mean, they speak several languages. They've got sort of, for example, I guess you speak already. I'm going to make a guess. You probably speak 3 at least, okay? Cantonese, Mandarin, and French. English. If you speak English, French is fairly straightforward. There are 40,000 French words in the English language we use every day. Not necessarily every day, it's a lot of words, but it's students tend to have that obstacle. They see it as an obstacle. They tend to think, oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to speak this. Once they're into it, they think, oh, this is actually quite interesting. All these nouns, which are masculine, feminine, or plural, it's not that complicated. Then they begin to enjoy it. Then they begin to use it. Then they build the confidence. It's just like any student come on any language course. But what we also have to bear in mind is the students who get into Grande École are very bright cookies anyway. So they can deal with things. It's not that complicated.
Right. And then it would be an advantage having an additional language when you come back to Hong Kong,
Absolutely.
especially French. No, I don't think about how many people will speak French in Hong Kong. Certainly that will be putting them into a position where it's desired in a way, especially wanting to have a business with the French and so on and so on. But so yeah. But what about students Well, shall we talk about after graduation?
Mm-hmm.
What if student, because when people think about studying in the English-speaking country, after graduation, they have the opportunity to stay behind and to work. So what about French? Do they have like a similar policy that allowing international students to do that?
Absolutely, and they've been very, very keen to sort of encourage students to come and take advantage of it. It's only just in recent years that France has begun to wake up to the opportunity for encouraging sort of bright young things from other countries to come in and fill its tech sector, to provide its next generation of business leaders and sort of, company operatives, etc., etc. So that's exactly why they've not exactly opened up the doors, but they're very, very selective about who they let in. And I think they've got, they're quite keen to sort of, discourage the same kind of situation that's happened recently in places like Canada, Australia, where obviously those countries, opened up the gates many, many years ago, and suddenly they see, probably too many people working in the very, very low casual sector, working as baristas or sort of, Uber drivers, that kind of thing. And what they really want are people to fill the tech sector and the entrepreneurial side of things. So France is quite keen to do that. So they do have a very, very kind of very fairly straightforward post-study work environment, which is, firstly, you get to spend a year whereby you don't have to work. So at the end of your degree, you're allowed to spend a year when you're looking for work. So that's kind of, so you don't have to have a job to go to. You get the year to look around. Followed by, when you do get the job, you get a 4-year work permit. So effectively, you're getting a 5-year stay-back option, which is quite sort of an attractive thing. So long as you're maintaining a certain level of income during that time of 39,000 euros. Once you reach a certain threshold, 54,000 euros, you can actually even begin sort of looking for, applying for what the French call the blue card, which is the sort of, the kind of the more long-term solution. It's not something that France goes out and sort of really kind of makes a noise about. It's, it's also it's a country with a very, very large immigrant sector anyway, but it's obviously trying to encourage a different type of sort of, kind of highly qualified, highly educated individual to sort of, fill in those gaps, because obviously, like all the countries in Western Europe, France has the same issue as others, same in North America, same in Australasia. These are the amount of information jobs, these are the amount of people, and you have basically a massive skills gap, and they're trying to fill up the right kind of qualifications.
Okay, so what about the friends looking for the skills, or what program that we will encourage students to study in France, in Paris?
I think business is still very much the sort of the main area of interest for most people. I think France is, interesting enough, actually, obviously there's the business and fashion, the two things that sell itself very, very well. But another very, very understated area is the IT sector. For example, France is one of the most highly developed artificial intelligence environments in the whole of Europe. It's very strong for games design, for graphic design. Obviously anything where you combine technology and creativity. Obviously you've got the French creative mindset, plus the sort of, brilliant technological skills, translated into educational programs. You have again, an untapped sector, and it's another area where France, I think you'll see in the next couple of years, France will really come into its own by having more programs in English. This time next year, we're going to be launching, it's going to be probably a year before we do it, before we go into the IT sector. We're still finding our feet in the business and fashion spheres, and once we do that, we'll sort of move into the IT sector. So that's one to watch. But for the time being, I would say that the fashion sphere is still very much an area of interest for students from this part of the world. France is by far and away the most well-known fashion hub in the world. Paris is the fashion capital of the world, the design capital of the world, and that's an incredible area for our students to go into. I first came to Hong Kong in 1987. I just want to throw that in there. A long time ago, and I was actually, astonished at sort of the kind of the levels of fashion interest at that time. But at the same time, I'd just come out from China, and sort of there, I was talking to people, and China was in a very, very different state of development 40 years ago than what it is now. But I'm going into China tonight, and I'm going to be talking to people tomorrow. I'm going to be talking to groups of young people who are going to be interested in coming over to be working for companies like Louis Vuitton, Hermes, Gucci, Nina Ricci, Estee Lauder, and so on and so forth. If you told me 40 years ago that that's what I was going to be doing 40 years later, I would have thought you were absolutely bonkers. But that's what I'm going to be doing. And that's how rapidly the world has changed over the past 40 years, where students from China can go and work in the luxury sphere overseas in Paris. It's amazing. It's a privilege to be working in that sphere as well.
because back in time, because I studied fashion marketing in the UK, so back at the time I wasn't thinking, well, studying France, even knowing that the 4 biggest fashion hub will be Paris, Milan, London, and in New York. But then it's kind of like I hesitate kind of thinking, well, going to France or Milan, it's the language barrier that you mentioned.
Indeed.
But then didn't realize, and also thinking, well, because in the Eastern world, our side is more the production hub for the fashion industry rather than the designer house and all this big names like Louis Vuitton or like Chanel, those. So I'm thinking, well, the one that put me off is kind of thinking, well, what if I didn't stay in the UK and end up coming back in Hong Kong? What was my opportunities here? So I was limited to myself. Well, am I going back to the textiles factories and all this kind of like garment production? But it's completely not knowing the knowledge and also the information that available that in that time. So I was like kind of regretted. I'm like, I should have gone to Paris, right? So it is completely different spectrum that you mentioned, because the UK is more the retail business side that's associated with the fashion. But to be honest, how many UK fashion brand do we know? And but definitely, I'm thinking maybe, well, Paris, even for the master degree, very budget.
Never too late.
That's never too late, absolutely.
Doing a master there.
Yeah. Well, it has that reputation, it has that allure, it has that kind of je ne sais quoi, to quote the French. It has that kind of attraction, and the appeal is there, and the opportunity is there. And it's a realistic opportunity for our students to go over there and to be studying it. And of course, 30, 40 years ago, it probably, actually when you wanted to go, it probably wasn't as prevalent in English as it is now. So, now it's completely in English. And we work with quite a few sort of major, in fact, major fashion schools in France, actually. Our prime partner is an organization called LISA, which stands for in French, it's l'Institut Supérieur des Arts Appliqués, which means the Higher Institute of Applied Arts, and that is the biggest design school in France. And they offer routes for students from both the creative side, but also from the business side. So if you want to get into the business side, the fashion, marketing, merchandising, retail, distribution, all those different types of areas, that's absolutely possible. And that's probably what you were thinking when you were making that choice. But if you want to get into the actual design side of things, textile design, pattern design, graphic design, animation, sort of, that's all possible too. So it's an incredible sort of world of opportunity. And most students, when they want to go into the world of fashion, they tend to think it's just fashion business or it's fashion design. But if you look beneath that, there's a whole range of different branches you can go into. There's fragrances, cosmetics management, there's kind of Italian design, there's French urban design, there's kind of all kinds of things you can go into. It's an incredible sort of cornucopia of different programs that are available to students. They're just not aware of that. Yeah.
Under the fashion brand, the umbrella, there was like women's wear, knitwear, all this kind of opportunities as well.
Absolutely.
But for Hong Kong students, would they struggle if they not coming from a very artistic background, would you say?
We don't actually have like a portfolio requirement for our students. So even if a student who come from, less, they don't really have an art and design background, let's say, they can still come for a foundation to study with us, and then we will help them prepare the portfolio for progression.
Yeah, as long as they show a certain aptitude, a certain interest, and have a passion for the subject area, then we can sort of guide them along. Yeah, Ruby's right. The portfolio is everything, so we prepare the portfolio with the students, help them to do that in order to progress into the first year. But we also have a program which is, beginning next year from September 2025, we have two types of programs. One is the foundation program, the other one is the International Year 1 in fashion management. So that is effectively for students who want to go directly into Year 1 of fashion management. We say fashion management, but it includes everything, sort of, includes the marketing, includes, business management, etc. That's all included in there, baked into one program. Then we've got sort of obviously the one for the creators and one for the sort of the more business-minded students as well.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I think we're about time today, but yes, definitely. So Paris, definitely. If anyone of hearing our study on Spotlight, our audience, and interested in doing fashion or business, or even looking for affordable studying destination, a more practical one, definitely please consider on campus Paris and Paris as your destination. So thank you, Will. Thank you, Ruby, for coming today. So if you have any question, please feel free to contact us or contact Ruby and Will as well. So see you next time then. Bye.
Bye-bye.